Marshall's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he turned onto his street. At 38, he felt older than his years. The weight of the Sustainable Building Conference in Singapore still pressed on his mind. Ideas buzzed like angry bees, innovations that could change the face of architecture forever. But as he approached his modest suburban home, something caught his eye that didn't belong. A gleaming red sports car sat in the driveway. Its sleek lines were a stark contrast to the well-worn sedans and practical minivans that dotted the neighborhood. Marshall's brow furrowed. He knew that car. It belonged to Roger, his colleague and supposed friend. What was it doing here? As he drew closer to the house, the sound of laughter drifted through the open living room window. Marshall's steps slowed, cold dread settling in his stomach. He peered inside, his heart stopping at the sight that greeted him. Ruby, his wife of 10 years, sat on the couch next to Roger. Their faces were close, too close, and the intimacy of their posture spoke volumes. Marshall watched, frozen. As Ruby threw her head back in laughter at something Roger had said, her hand rested casually on his arm. My failure of a son finally made it. Marshall nearly jumped out of his skin. He turned to find his father, Frederick, standing behind him with a smirk that made Marshall's skin crawl. Your friend is here, Frederick continued, his voice dripping with disdain. Now he's family. He's been slipping me cash to keep quiet. The words hit Marshall like a physical blow. He pushed past his father, his mind reeling as he entered the house. Ruby and Roger sprang apart at the sound of the door. Their faces showed shock and guilt, confirming Marshall's worst fears. Marshall, you're home early, Ruby stammered, smoothing her dress with trembling hands. Marshall said nothing. He couldn't trust himself to speak. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked to his home office, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Once inside his office, Marshall's eyes fell on the painting that hung on the wall, a snapshot of his and Ruby's wedding day. The memory of that happier time now felt like a cruel joke. With steady hands that belied the turmoil in his heart, he removed the painting to reveal the hidden wall safe behind it. The safe opened with a soft click, and Marshall began emptying its contents into his briefcase. Stacks of cash, property deeds, financial documents, all the physical proof of the life he and Ruby had built together. Now it felt like ashes in his hands. He was so focused on his task that he didn't hear Ruby approach until she spoke from the doorway. You can't just walk out with those, she cried, her voice shrill with panic. I own them too. Marshall turned to face her, and for a moment, he barely recognized the woman he had married. Her familiar features were twisted with fear and desperation, and he wondered how long she had been wearing this mask. You all will burn in hell, he said, his voice cold and sharp as a knife's edge. And this is just the beginning. He pushed past her, clutching the briefcase like a lifeline. In the living room, Roger and Frederick stood awkwardly. Their earlier bravado evaporated in the face of Marshall's quiet fury. Marshall paused at the door, turning to face the three people who had betrayed him so completely. His next words were not just a statement, but a promise that sent chills down their spines. You thought I was weak. You thought you could play me for a fool, but I promise you this. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you had never crossed me. With that, he walked out, leaving behind a house filled with the wreckage of his former life. As Marshall drove away, his phone exploded with calls and messages. He ignored them all, his mind already formulating a plan. He needed a place to think, to regroup, to begin piecing together the extent of the betrayal. The Pinewood Motel loomed ahead, a rundown establishment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it would serve his purposes. Marshall paid for a room in cash, giving a false name to the disinterested clerk. Once in the dingy room, Marshall spread the documents across the worn bedspread. Bank statements, credit card bills, property deeds. Each piece of paper told a story of deceit that stretched back further than he had imagined. As the night wore on, sleep eluded him. The weight of the day's revelations pressed down on him, threatening to crush his spirit. But beneath the pain and betrayal, a spark of determination began to grow. At 3 a.m., Marshall reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Mom," he said when the line connected, his voice cracking. "Everything's fallen apart." Lorraine listened in silence as Marshall recounted the day's events. When he finished, her voice was steady and determined. "Come over," she insisted. Now, the drive to Lorraine's apartment was a blur. Marshall found himself standing at her door, feeling like a lost child seeking comfort. But the woman who answered was not the mother he remembered from his youth. Lorraine's eyes were sharp, her posture straight and purposeful. "Let's get to work," she said, ushering him inside. Lorraine's living room had been transformed into a makeshift war room. Laptops hummed on every available surface, and the walls were covered in notes and diagrams. "I've been waiting for this day," Lorraine explained as she began to sort through the documents Marshall had brought. "I knew that woman was trouble from the start." As a retired forensic accountant, Lorraine's expertise quickly revealed a pattern that made Marshall's blood run cold. There were withdrawals and hidden accounts in Ruby's name, dating back years. "Marshall," Lorraine said, "this goes back further than you think. Look at these transactions. They coincide with every major setback in your career." The revelation hit Marshall like a physical blow. How could I have been so blind? Lorraine's hand on his shoulder was comforting, but her words were all business. "We're not done yet. There's more to uncover." As they delved deeper into the financial records, a young woman entered the room. She couldn't have been more than 25, with bright eyes that spoke of sharp intelligence. "Marshall, this is Nina," Lorraine introduced. "She's a cybersecurity expert I've been mentoring. We need to dig deeper legally." Nina nodded, her fingers already flying over a keyboard. "We'll need to gather digital evidence carefully," she explained. "Everything we do has to be above board if we want it to hold up." As they worked, Nana uncovered a series of emails forwarded from Marshall's account to Roger containing confidential project bids and designs. The betrayal ran deeper than anyone had imagined. As dawn broke, Marshall felt a strange mix of emotions. The pain of betrayal was still raw, but it was now tempered by a sense of purpose. He looked at Lorraine and Nina, these unexpected allies in his darkest hour, and felt a surge of determination. "They thought I was a failure," he said quietly, his voice gaining strength with each word. "I'll show them what failure truly means." Lorraine and Nina exchanged a glance, recognizing the steel in Marshall's voice. The game had changed, and the players had no idea what was coming. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, Marshall stood and stretched. The weight of the past 24 hours pressed down on him, but he refused to be crushed. There was work to be done, a reckoning to be had. The Marshall they knew, the trusting husband, the loyal friend, the dutiful son, was gone. In his place stood a man forged in betrayal, ready to show the world just how dangerous he could be. Carlos Mendoza's office at Urbanscape Developments exuded an aura of success and power. The expansive windows offered a panoramic view of the city's skyline, a testament to the many projects Carlos had overseen during his illustrious career. As CEO, he had mentored countless young architects, but few had shown as much promise as Marshall. When his secretary announced Marshall's unexpected visit, Carlos welcomed him warmly. However, the moment Marshall stepped into the office, Carlos sensed something was amiss. The young architect's eyes, usually alight with enthusiasm, now burned with cold determination that sent a chill down Carlos' spine. "I need your help," Marshall began without preamble, his voice steady and grave. "And you need to know the truth about Roger." Carlos leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowing. "What's this about, Marshall?" In response, Marshall opened his briefcase and began laying out documents on Carlos' desk. As Carlos examined each piece of evidence, his face grew increasingly pale. Project bids with telltale signs of manipulation, designs unmistakably Marshall's work bearing Roger's signature, safety reports with glaring omissions. "My God," Carlos whispered, his hand shaking slightly as he picked up a particularly damning document. "This affects the integrity of our entire industry." Marshall nodded. "It goes deeper than you can imagine, Carlos. Roger's been stealing my designs for years, manipulating bids, cutting corners on safety. And he's not working alone." For the next hour, Marshall laid out the entire sordid tale, the betrayal, the affair, the corruption that reached into the highest levels of their profession. By the time he finished, Carlos looked as though he had aged a decade. "What do you need from me?" he asked, his voice hushed. "Your influence," Marshall replied. "Your connections. We need to bring this to light, but in a way that can't be traced back to me." "Not yet." Carlos nodded slowly, his mind already working on a plan. "We'll start with the architectural licensing board. Anonymous tips, carefully crafted. They won't be able to ignore this." Over the next few days, Carlos and Marshall worked tirelessly, compiling evidence and crafting a series of anonymous reports detailing Roger's history of safety violations and ethical breaches. Each tip was a carefully aimed arrow designed to pierce the armor of Roger's reputation. As the reports began to circulate, Marshall set the next phase of his plan into motion. A charity gala provided the perfect opportunity to leverage his network. With a glass of champagne in hand and a practiced smile on his face, Marshall moved through the crowd, sharing carefully redacted versions of the evidence with key industry players. "Have you heard about the investigation into Urbanscape's recent projects?" he would murmur, his voice pitched low as if sharing a confidence. "I can't say much, but well, let's just say I wouldn't want my name associated with anything coming out of that firm right now." The whispers spread like wildfire through the gala, each conversation adding fuel to the growing inferno that threatened to consume Roger's career. Meanwhile, Nina had been working her own magic. Her fingers flew across her keyboard, her eyes scanning line after line of code as she wormed her way into Roger's email account. "Jackpot," she whispered, a triumphant grin spreading across her face as she uncovered a goldmine of incriminating correspondence between Roger, Ruby, and Frederick. Marshall leaned over her shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he read the damning messages. "Send copies of the most incriminating ones to Roger's top clients," he instructed. "Anonymously, of course. Let's make sure his professional downfall is complete." Within weeks, the effects of their calculated assault became apparent. Roger's once bustling office grew quiet as clients dropped him one by one. His bids, once considered sure things for major projects, were now routinely rejected. The man who had once strutted through industry events like a peacock now skulking in the shadows, his face haggard and his eyes haunted. Marshall watched it all unfold with satisfaction. "This is just the beginning," he thought. "The storm is gathering, and Roger has no idea of the devastation that is yet to come." Lorraine's living room had become a war room. Every surface was covered with financial documents, laptops humming with activity. The retired forensic accountant stood before a large whiteboard, her sharp eyes tracing the web of transactions she had uncovered. "It's worse than we thought," she said, her voice tight with anger. Ruby, Roger, and several shell companies. They'd been running a complex money laundering scheme for years. Marshall's jaw clenched as he absorbed the information. "How much?" "Millions," Lorraine replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "They've been siphoning funds from your joint accounts, from project budgets, from everywhere they could get their hands on." Marshall nodded, his face a mask of cold determination. Time to cut off their supply. The next morning found Marshall in a sleek conference room at his bank's headquarters. Across from him sat the head of the fraud department, a severe-looking woman named Janet Cho. "Mr. Buford," Janet began, her voice clipped and professional. "You understand the seriousness of these allegations." Marshall met her gaze steadily. "I do. And I have irrefutable evidence to back them up." For the next 2 hours, Marshall laid out the case against Ruby, presenting bank statements, transfer records, and a detailed timeline of the embezzlement. By the time he finished, Janet's professional demeanor had cracked, revealing a mix of shock and outrage. "We'll freeze all shared assets and credit lines immediately," she assured him, her fingers already flying over her keyboard. "Mrs. Buford won't be able to access a penny." As Marshall left the bank, a small vindictive part of him wished he could see Ruby's face when her cards were declined. He didn't have to wait long for that satisfaction. That evening, Nina's surveillance program pinged with an alert. "Ruby just tried to check into the Ritz-Carlton," she reported, a hint of glee in her voice. Her card was declined. All of them. Marshall allowed himself a small cold smile as he imagined Ruby's panic, her growing realization that her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. But he wasn't done yet. The next morning, he met with his lawyer, a sharp woman named Evelyn Ruff. "I want to file for divorce," Marshall stated without preamble. "On the grounds of infidelity and financial fraud." Evelyn's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded. "With the evidence you've presented, we can ensure she receives nothing in the settlement. It'll be the nail in her financial coffin." As Evelyn began drafting the divorce petition, complete with a detailed account of Ruby's misdeeds, Nana burst into the office, her face flushed with excitement. "You're not going to believe what I found," she exclaimed, setting her laptop on the desk. "Emails between Frederick and several developers. He's been accepting bribes to push through unsafe building permits. It's a full-blown zoning corruption scandal." Marshall's eyes narrowed as he scanned the emails. "This is exactly what we need to bring Frederick down, but we need to be careful about how we use it." After some discussion, they decided on a plan. Marshall would anonymously tip off an ambitious FBI agent he knew from a previous case. The agent, hungry for a high-profile bust, would jump at the chance to investigate a corruption scandal involving a prominent political figure. The effects were almost immediate. As news of the FBI probe broke, Frederick's political allies began to distance themselves. His campaign for city council, once considered a sure thing, crumbled overnight. The man who had always looked down on Marshall as a failure now found himself facing the very real possibility of prison time. As Marshall watched the news coverage of Frederick's fall from grace, he felt a complex mix of emotions. There was satisfaction, certainly at seeing justice served, but there was also a deep aching sadness for what could have been for the family bonds that had been irreparably shattered by greed and betrayal. But he pushed those feelings aside. There was no room for sentiment in this war. The storm he had unleashed was gathering strength, and there was no turning back now. But the knocking on Marshall's apartment door came late one night, startling him from a fitful sleep. He glanced at the security feed Nina had installed. His lips curled into a smile as he saw Ruby, Roger, and Frederick huddled in the hallway. "Right on time," he murmured, pressing a button to activate the hidden cameras throughout the apartment. He opened the door calmly, stepping aside as the trio burst in. Ruby's face was tear-stained, her once immaculate appearance now disheveled. Roger's eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal, while Frederick's face was a mask of barely contained fury. "You've ruined us," Roger shouted, his face contorted with rage. He took a menacing step towards Marshall, his fists clenched to his sides. Ruby grabbed Roger's arm, holding him back. "How could you do this to your own family?" she cried, tears streaming down her face. Marshall let out a harsh laugh. "Love? Support? Is that what you call betraying me behind my back? Is that what you call stealing my designs, sabotaging my career?" Frederick stepped forward, his voice low and threatening. "You ungrateful little. After everything I've done for you, everything you've done for me." Marshall cut him off. "You mean like taking bribes to push through unsafe building permits? Like putting people's lives at risk for your own gain?" The color drained from Frederick's face. "How did you?" But Marshall was already moving, retrieving a small device from his desk. With the press of a button, the room filled with audio recordings, Ruby and Roger laughing about their affair, Frederick discussing bribes with developers. "I've only just begun," Marshall said coldly, his voice cutting through their shocked silence. "Everything you've done, every lie, every betrayal, it all comes out now." Roger, his face twisted with fury, lunged at Marshall. But Marshall was prepared. He sidestepped smoothly, watching with satisfaction as Roger crashed into a nearby table. The entire incident was caught on camera, another piece of evidence to add to his growing collection. As the trio stood there, stunned and defeated, Marshall's parting words hung in the air like a death sentence. "You thought I was weak or a failure. Remember this moment when you realized how wrong you were." They left in silence, the fight drained out of them. As the door closed behind them, Marshall let out a long, shaky breath. The confrontation had gone exactly as he'd planned, but the emotional toll was higher than he'd anticipated. He sank into a chair, feeling every bit of the exhaustion that had been building over the past weeks. The storm he had unleashed was reaching its peak, and there was no turning back now. But as he sat there in the quiet of his apartment, Marshall allowed himself a moment to mourn, not for the people who had betrayed him, but for the man he had once been. The trust he had lost, the innocence that could never be regained. Tomorrow, he knew the war would continue. But for tonight, in the aftermath of this confrontation, Marshall let himself feel the full weight of what he had lost and what he had become. The town hall stood like a sentinel at the heart of the community. Its weathered brick facade was a testament to the countless meetings and gatherings it had hosted over the years. Tonight, however, it would bear witness to an event unlike any in its long history. Marshall stood backstage, his heart pounding in his chest. The murmur of the gathering crowd filtered through the heavy curtains, a reminder of the magnitude of what he was about to do. He glanced down at the USB drive in his hand, knowing that its contents would shatter the carefully constructed lies that had poisoned his life for so long. As he peered through a gap in the curtains, he caught sight of Ruby, Roger, and Frederick taking their seats near the front. They looked nervous, fidgeting in their chairs and casting furtive glances around the room. They had no idea what was coming. The mayor's introduction seemed to drag on forever. Finally, Marshall heard his name called. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding him. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his gut. "Thank you all for coming out tonight. We're here to discuss urban renewal, but today we're going to talk about renewal of a different kind." A ripple of confusion passed through the audience. Marshall caught Ruby's eye for a moment, seeing the flash of fear that crossed her face. Good, he thought. She should be afraid. With a click of the remote, the first slide appeared on the screen behind him. Gasps rose from the crowd as they saw the damning evidence: Frederick's signature on bribe receipts, Roger's stolen designs side by side with Marshall's originals, bank statements showing Ruby's systematic embezzlement. For years, Marshall continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Our community has been betrayed by those we trusted most. My father, Frederick Buford, has been accepting bribes to push through unsafe building permits, putting countless lives at risk for his own gain." Frederick's face turned ashen, his eyes darting towards the exits. But Marshall was far from done. "My colleague and supposed friend, Roger Dalton, has been stealing my designs and passing them off as his own, all while carrying on an affair with my wife. And my wife, Ruby, has been embezzling funds not only from our joint accounts, but from various charities and community projects." The crowd's reaction was visceral. Gasps of shock turned to angry murmurs as neighbors turned to stare at the trio with disgust and disbelief. Marshall could see the moment when the full weight of their actions crashed down upon them. As he continued to present the evidence, Marshall noticed a woman in the back of the hall, her phone held high. It was Bridget Chen, a local reporter known for her tenacious pursuit of the truth. She was live streaming the entire event, ensuring that this scandal would reach far beyond the walls of the town hall. The live stream seemed to open a floodgate. Community members began to stand up, sharing their own stories of how they'd been affected by the trio's actions. "My son was injured when that new apartment complex collapsed," one woman cried out, pointing an accusing finger at Frederick. "You approved those faulty designs." Another man shouted, his voice thick with emotion. "Ruby, you told us the money had been stolen. It was you all along." As the accusations flew, Ruby, Roger, and Frederick seemed to shrink in their seats. They exchanged panicked glances, clearly realizing that their carefully constructed world was crumbling around them. Unable to bear the onslaught any longer, they stood and made a desperate dash for the exit. But their escape was cut short as they were met at the doors by a wall of angry citizens and a swarm of reporters, alerted by Bridget's live stream. Marshall watched from the stage as the three people who had betrayed him so thoroughly were engulfed by the crowd. A part of him felt satisfaction at their downfall, but another part, a part he thought long dead, felt a twinge of something else. Not quite regret, but a sadness for what could have been. As the chaos unfolded, Marshall slipped quietly off the stage. His part in this drama was done. The truth was out, and now it would take on a life of its own. He stepped out into the cool night air, leaving behind the shouts and recriminations. For the first time in months, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The lies had been exposed, the betrayals laid bare. Now, perhaps he could finally begin to move forward. The aftermath of the town hall meeting was a whirlwind of media frenzy and legal proceedings. Marshall found himself at the center of a storm he had created, fielding calls from reporters and investigators alike. But amidst the chaos, an unexpected call came through. "Mr. Buford." The voice on the other end asked. "This is Yuki Tanaka from Ecovision Architects in Tokyo." Marshall's brow furrowed in confusion. "Miss Tanaka, I'm not sure I understand." "I've seen your designs, Mr. Buford," Yuki continued. "The ones that Roger Dalton claimed as his own. They're revolutionary. We've been looking for someone with your vision to lead our new eco-friendly development project in Osaka." Marshall felt a surge of emotions, surprise, pride, and a glimmer of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. "I'm flattered, Miss Tanaka, but how did you?" "The scandal has gone global, Mr. Buford. Your integrity in exposing the corruption, combined with the brilliance of your work, has caught the attention of many in our industry. We at Ecovision believe in second chances and new beginnings. We'd like to offer you that chance." As Yuki outlined the details of the project, Marshall felt a spark of excitement he thought he'd lost forever. This was an opportunity to start fresh, to rebuild his career and his life on his own terms. "I'll need some time to consider your offer, Miss Tanaka," Marshall said, his mind already racing with possibilities. "Of course. Take all the time you need. We believe you're the right person for this project, Mr. Buford. We'll be waiting for your decision." After hanging up, Marshall sat in silence for a long moment, contemplating the unexpected turn his life had taken. Then, almost on autopilot, he found himself driving to his childhood home. The old family home stood empty, a hollow shell of what it once was. As Marshall pushed open the front door, the hinges creaked in protest, as if the house itself was reluctant to admit him. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the gloom, settling on the bare floors where furniture had once stood. The house looked different somehow, smaller and more worn than he remembered. A figure emerged from the shadows of the porch. It was Ruby, looking like a ghost of her former self. "Marshall," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Ah, I've changed. Please, can't we start over?" She reached out for him, her eyes pleading, but Marshall took a step back. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the woman he had loved, but a stranger wearing her face. "The time for that has long passed, Ruby," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I'm not the man you thought you could fool anymore." Ruby's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes, but Marshall had no comfort to offer her. He moved past her, entering the house to collect the last of his belongings. A figure stumbled out from behind him. It was Roger, disheveled and reeking of alcohol. "Marshall, please," Roger slurred, falling to his knees. "I'll confess. I'll tell everyone it was all me. Just call off the professional wolves. I'm ruined, man. Ruined." Marshall looked down at the pathetic figure before him, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Anger, pity, disgust. "Your confession means nothing now, Roger," he said quietly. "The truth has a way of coming out, with or without you." Frederick's car pulled into the driveway. All three of them together met Marshall one last time. Ruby, Roger, and Frederick filed in behind him, their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The weight of their actions hung heavy in the air, almost palpable in its intensity. "I wanted you to see the consequences of your betrayal," Marshall began, his voice steady and cold. "This empty house is a monument to the lies you've built your lives upon." Ruby flinched at his words, her eyes darting around the barren living room as if searching for ghosts of happier times. Roger stood with his head bowed, unable to meet Marshall's gaze. Frederick, however, met his son's eyes defiantly, though the tremor in his hands betrayed his unease. "I've made a decision," Marshall continued. "I'm accepting a position in Osaka, a chance to start over, to build something meaningful. You're leaving." Ruby's voice was barely above a whisper, thick with unshed tears. Marshall nodded. "I'm choosing to move forward. I'm not seeking your forgiveness, nor am I offering mine. But I am choosing to leave the past where it belongs." He paused, letting his words sink in. Then, with a hint of satisfaction, he delivered the final blow. "I've donated a significant portion of the recovered assets to a foundation supporting victims of fraud and betrayal." It seemed fitting, given the circumstances. The news hit them like a physical blow. Frederick's face turned red with anger, while Ruby let out a choked sob. Roger simply looked defeated, as if the last of his spirit had been crushed. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, to everyone's surprise, Frederick spoke up, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "Son, I was wrong about you. About everything." Marshall studied his father's face, searching for any hint of deception. But for perhaps the first time in Frederick's life, his words rang true. Marshall nodded, acknowledging his father's words, but not accepting them as absolution. "Goodbye," he said simply, turning towards the door. As he stepped out onto the porch, leaving behind a wreckage of his old life, Marshall felt a sense of lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, a fitting backdrop for this final chapter. He climbed into his car, casting one last glance at the house in his rearview mirror. As he pulled away, the cityscape began to fade, replaced by the promise of a new horizon. The road ahead was long, and Marshall knew the journey wouldn't be easy. The scars of betrayal ran deep, and trust would not come easily again. But as the miles rolled by, he felt a growing sense of possibility. In the end, he reflected, the greatest revenge wasn't in destroying those who had wronged him. It was in rising above their betrayal and building a life they could never touch or taint. The future stretched out before him, a blank canvas waiting to be filled. As the last vestiges of his old life disappeared in the rearview mirror, Marshall allowed himself a small smile. The storm had passed, and though the damage it had wrought would take time to heal, he was finally free to chart his own course. The road wound on, carrying him towards Osaka, towards new challenges and opportunities. And for the first time in a long time, Marshall Buford looked to the future not with dread, but with hope. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.